The War in the West, September 1939 to June 1940. During their campaign in Poland, the Germans kept only 23 divisions in the west to guard their frontier against the French, who had nearly 5 times as many divisions mobilized. The French commander-in-chief, General Maurice Gustave Chamberlain, proposed an advance against Germany through neutral Belgium and the Netherlands in order to have room to exercise his ponderous military machine. He was overruled, however, and French assaults on the 100-mile stretch of available front along the Franco-German frontier had barely dented the German defenses when the collapse of Poland prompted the recall of Chamberlain's advanced divisions to defensive positions in the Maginot Line. From October 1939 to March 1940, successive plans were developed for counteraction in the event of a German offensive through Belgium, all of them based on the assumption that the Germans would come across the plain north of Namur, not across the hilly and wooded Ardennes. The Germans would indeed have taken the route foreseen by the French if Hitler's desire for an offensive in November 1939 had not been frustrated, on the one hand, by bad weather and, on the other, by the hesitations of his generals. But in March 1940 the bold suggestion of General Erich von Manstein that an offensive through the Ardennes should, in fact, be practicable for tank forces was adopted by Hitler, despite orthodox military opinion. Meanwhile, Hitler's immediate outlook had been changed by considerations about Scandinavia. Originally he had intended to respect Norway's neutrality. Then rumors leaked out, prematurely, of British designs on Norway, as, in fact, Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, was arguing that mines should be laid in Norwegian waters to stop the export of Swedish iron ore from Gallivare to Germany through Norway's rail terminus and port of Narvik. The British cabinet, in response to Churchill, authorized at least the preparation of a plan for a landing at Narvik, and in mid-December 1939 a Norwegian politician, Vidkun Quisling, leader of a pro-Nazi party, was introduced to Hitler. On January 27, 1940, Hitler ordered plans for an invasion of Norway, for use if he could no longer respect Norway's neutrality. After France's failure to interrupt the German conquest of Poland, the Western powers and the Germans were so inactive with regard to land operations that journalists began to speak derisively over the next 6 months of the phony war. At sea, however, the period was somewhat more eventful. German U-boats sank the British aircraft carrier Courageous, September 17, and the battleship Royal Oak, October 14. The U-boats' main warfare, however, was against merchant shipping. They sank more than 110 vessels in the first 4 months of the war. Both the Germans and the British, meanwhile, were engaged in extensive mine-laying. In surface warfare at sea, the British were on the whole more fortunate than the Germans. A German pocket battleship in the Atlantic, the Admiral Graf Spee, sank 9 ships before coming to a tragic end, having sustained and inflicted damage in an engagement with 3 British cruisers off the Rio de la Plata on December 13, 1939. She made off to Montevideo and obtained leave to spend 4 days there for repairs. The British mustered reinforcements for the 2 cruisers still capable of action after the engagement, namely the Ajax and the Achilles, and brought the Cumberland to the scene in time. But on December 17, when the Graf Spee put to sea again, her crew scuttled her a little way out of the harbor before the fight could be resumed. The invasion of Norway. British plans for landings on the Norwegian coast in the 3rd week of March 1940 were temporarily postponed. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, however, was by that time convinced that some aggressive action ought to be taken, and Paul Reynaud, who succeeded Edouard Daladier as France's premier on March 21, was of the same opinion. Reynaud had come into office on the surge of the French public's demand for a more aggressive military policy and quicker offensive action against Germany. It was agreed that mines should be laid in Norwegian waters and that the mining should be followed by the landing of troops at 4 Norwegian ports, Narvik, Trondheim, Bergen, and Stavanger. Because of Anglo-French arguments, the date of the mining was postponed from April 5 to April 8. The postponement was catastrophic. Hitler had on April 1 ordered the German invasion of Norway to begin on April 9. So, when on April 8 the Norwegian government was preoccupied with earnest protest about the British mine-laying, the German expeditions were well on their way. On April 9, 1940, the major Norwegian ports from Oslo northward to Narvik, 1,200 miles away from Germany's naval bases, were occupied by advanced detachments of German troops. At the same time, a single parachute battalion, the first ever employed in warfare, took the Oslo and Stavanger airfields, and 800 operational aircraft overawed the Norwegian population. Norwegian resistance at Narvik, at Trondheim, the strategic key to Norway, at Bergen, at Stavanger, and at Kristiansand had been overcome very quickly, and Oslo's effective resistance to the seaborne forces was nullified when German troops from the airfield entered the city. Simultaneously, along with their Norwegian enterprise, the Germans on April 9 occupied Denmark, sending troopships, covered by aircraft, into Copenhagen harbor and marching over the land frontier into Jutland. This occupation was obviously necessary for the safety of their communications with Norway. Allied troops began to land at Narvik on April 14. Shortly afterward, British troops were landed also at Namsos and at Andelsens, to attack Trondheim from the north and from the south, respectively. The Germans, however, landed fresh troops in the rear of the British at Namsos and advanced up the Gudbrandsdal from Oslo against the force at Andelsens. By this time the Germans had about 25,000 troops in Norway. By May 2, both Namsos and Andelsens were evacuated by the British. The Germans at Narvik held out against 5 times as many British and French troops until May 27. By that time the German offensive in France had progressed to such an extent that the British could no longer afford any commitment in Norway, and the 25,000 Allied troops were evacuated from Narvik 10 days after their victory. The Norwegian King Haakon VII and his government left Norway for Britain at the same time. Hitler garrisoned Norway with about 300,000 troops for the rest of the war. By occupying Norway, Hitler had ensured the protection of Germany's supply of iron ore from Sweden, and had obtained naval and air bases with which to strike at Britain if necessary. What was to happen in Norway became a less important question for the Western powers when, on May 10, 1940, they were surprised by Hitler's long-debated stroke against them through the Low Countries. France's 800,000-man standing army was thought at the time to be the most powerful in Europe. But the French had not progressed beyond the defensive mentality inherited from World War I, and they relied primarily on their Maginot Line for protection against a German offensive. The Maginot Line was an extremely well-developed chain of fortifications running from the Swiss frontier opposite Basel northward along the left bank of the Rhine, and then northwestward no farther than Montmedy, near the Belgian frontier south of the Ardennes forest. The line consisted of a series of giant pillboxes and other defensive installations constructed in depth, equipped with underground supply and communications facilities, and connected by rail lines, with all its heavy guns pointed east at the German frontier. Depending heavily on the line as a defense against German attack, the French had 41 divisions manning it or backing it, whereas only 39 divisions were watching the long stretch of frontier north of it, from Montmedy through the Ardennes and across Flanders to the English Channel. In their plan for the invasion of France and the Low Countries, the Germans kept General Wilhelm von Leeb's Army Group C facing the Maginot Line so as to deter the French from diverting forces from it, while launching Bach's Army Group B into the basin of the lower Maas River north of Liège, and Rundstedt's Army Group A into the Ardennes. Army Group B comprised Kuckeler's 18th Army, with 1 armored division and airborne support, to attack the Netherlands, and Reichenau's 6th, with 2 armored divisions, to advance over the Belgian plain. These 2 armies would have to deal not only with the Dutch and Belgian armies but also with the forces that the Allies, according to their plan, would send into the Low Countries, namely 2 French armies and 9 British divisions. Rundstedt's Army Group A, however, was much stronger, comprising as it did Kluge's 4th Army, List's 12th, and General Ernst Busch's 16th, with General Maximilian von Weich's 2nd in reserve, besides a large armored group under Paul Ludwig von Kleist and a smaller one under General Hermann Hoth, and amounting in all to 44 divisions, 7 of them armored, with 27 divisions in reserve. Army Group A thus amounted to more than 1,500,000 men and more than 1,500 tanks, and it would strike at the weak hinge of the Allies' will into Belgium, that is to say, at 2 French armies, General Charles Hunziger's 2nd and General André Corrup's 9th, which together mustered only 12 infantry and 4 horse cavalry divisions and stood, respectively, east and west of Sedan on the least fortified stretch of the French frontier. Against this weak center of the Allied line were thus massed nearly 2/3 of Germany's forces in the west and nearly 3/4 of its tank forces. The Dutch army comprised 10 divisions and the equivalent of 10 more in smaller formations, and thus totaled more than 400,000 men. It apparently had a good chance of withstanding the German invasion, since the attacking German army comprised only 7 divisions, apart from the airborne forces it would use. The Dutch, however, had a wide front, a very sensitive and loosely settled rear, very few tanks, and no experience of modern warfare. On May 10th, the German attack on the Netherlands began with the capture by parachutists of the bridges at Moordijk, at Dordrecht, and at Rotterdam, and with landings on the airfields around The Hague. On the same day, the weakly held Peel Line, south of the westward turning arc of the Maas, was penetrated by the German land forces, and on May 11th the Dutch defenders fell back westward past Tilburg to Breda, with the consequence that the French 7th Army, under General Henri Giroux, whose leading forces had sped forward across Belgium over the 140 miles to Tilburg, fell back to Breda likewise. The German tanks thus had a clear road to Moordijk, and by noon on May 12th they were in the outskirts of Rotterdam. North of the Maas, meanwhile, where the bulk of the Dutch defense was concentrated, the Germans achieved a narrow breach of the Geld Valley line on May 12th, whereupon the Dutch, unable to counterattack, retreated to the Fortress of Holland, line protecting Utrecht and Amsterdam. Queen Wilhelmina and her government left the country for England on May 13th, and the next day the Dutch commander-in-chief, General Henri Gerard Winkelmann, surrendered to the Germans, who had threatened to bomb Rotterdam and Utrecht, as places in the front line of the fighting, if resistance continued. In fact, Rotterdam was bombed, after the capitulation, by 30 planes through a mistake in the Germans' signal communications. The news of the German onslaught in the Low Countries, dismaying as it was to the Allies, had one effect that was to be of momentous importance to their fortunes. Chamberlain, whose half-hearted conduct of the war had been bitterly criticized in the House of Commons during the debate of May 7 to 8 on the campaign in Norway, resigned office in the evening of May 10 and was succeeded as Prime Minister by Churchill, who formed a coalition government. For the first phase of the invasion of the Belgian plain north of Liège, Reichenau had 4 army corps, 1 armored corps, and only 500 airborne troops. But he also had massive cooperation from the German Luftwaffe, whose dive bombers and fighters played a major role in breaking down the Belgian defenses. West of the Maastricht, appendix, of indefensible Dutch territory separating Belgium from Germany, the fortress of Eben-Emael, immediately opposite Maastricht, and the line of the Albert Canal constituted the Belgians' foremost defensive position. On May 10 German airborne troops landed in gliders on the top of the fortress, and on bridges over the canal. On May 11 the Belgian front was broken, the German tanks running on westward and some of the infantry turning southward to take Liège from the rear, while the Belgians made a general retreat to the Antwerp, Namur, or Dille, line. French and British divisions had just arrived on the Still line, and General René Prieux's 2 tank divisions went out from it to challenge the German advance. After a big battle on May 14, however, Prieux's tanks had to retire to the consolidated Dille line, and on May 15, notwithstanding a successful defense against the German attack, Chamberlain ordered the abandonment of the position, because events farther to the south had made it strategically untenable. The chances for success of the German offensive against France hinged on a German advance through the hilly and dense Ardennes forest, which the French considered to be impassable to tanks. But the Germans did succeed in moving their tank columns through that difficult belt of country by means of an amazing feat of staff work. While the armored divisions used such roads through the forest as were available, infantry divisions started alongside them by using field and woodland paths and marched so fast across country that the leading ones reached the Meuse River only a day after the armored divisions had. The decisive operations in France were those of Rundstedt's Army Group A. Kleist's tanks on May 10 took only 3 hours to cover the 30 miles from the eastern border of independent Luxembourg to the southeastern border of Belgium, and on May 11 the French cavalry divisions that had ridden forward into the Ardennes to oppose them were thrown back over the Semoise River. By the evening of May 12 the Germans were across the Franco-Belgian frontier and overlooking the Meuse River. The defenses of this sector were rudimentary, and it was the least fortified stretch of the whole French front. Worse still, the defending French 2nd and 9th armies had hardly any anti-tank guns or anti-aircraft artillery with which to slow down the German armored columns and shoot down their dive bombers. Such was the folly of the French belief that a German armored thrust through the Ardennes was unlikely. Guderian's tanks were at Abbeville on May 20th, and on May 22 he turned northward to threaten Calais and Dunkirk, while Reinhardt, swinging south of the British rear at Arras, headed for the same objectives, the remaining ports by which the British Expeditionary Force, BF, could be evacuated. For the Allies, all communication between their northern and southern forces was severed by the arc of the westward German advance from the Ardennes to the Somme. The Allied armies in the north, having fallen back from the Dille line to the Escaut, Schelde, were being encircled, and already on May 19 the British commander, Viscount Gort, was considering the withdrawal of the BF by sea. On May 21, however, to satisfy orders from London for more positive action, he launched an attack from Arras southward against the right flank of the Germans' corridor. But though it momentarily alarmed the German High Command, this small counterstroke lacked the armored strength necessary for success. Meanwhile, Guderian's tanks had swept up past Boulogne and Calais and were crossing the canal defense line close to Dunkirk when, on May 24, an inexplicable order from Hitler not only stopped their advance but actually called them back to the canal line just as Guderian was expecting to drive into Dunkirk. Dunkirk was now the only port left available for the withdrawal of the mass of the BF from Europe, and the British cabinet at last decided to save what could be saved. The British Admiralty had been collecting every kind of small craft it could find to help in removing the troops, and the British retreat to the coast now became a race to evacuate the troops before the Germans could occupy Dunkirk. Evacuation began on May 26 and became still more urgent the next day, when the Belgians, their right wing and their center broken by Reichenau's advance, sued for an armistice. On May 27, likewise, bombing by the Luftwaffe put the harbor of Dunkirk out of use, so that many of the thousands of men thronging the 10-mile stretch of beaches had to be ferried out to sea by petty craft pressed into service by the Royal Navy and manned largely by amateur seamen, though the harbor's damaged breakwaters still offered a practicable exit for the majority. By June 4, when the operation came to an end, 198,000 British and 140,000 French and Belgian troops had been saved, but virtually all of their heavy equipment had to be abandoned, and, of the 41 destroyers participating, 6 were sunk and 19 others damaged. The men who were saved represented a considerable part of the experienced troops possessed by Great Britain and were an inestimable gain to the Allies. The success of the near-miraculous evacuation from Dunkirk was due, on the one hand, to fighter cover by the Royal Air Force from the English coast and on the other to Hitler's fatal order of May 24 halting Guderian. That order had been made for several reasons, chiefly, Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, had mistakenly assured Hitler that his aircraft alone could destroy the Allied troops trapped on the beaches at Dunkirk, and Hitler himself seems to have believed that Great Britain might accept peace terms more readily if its armies were not constrained into humiliating surrender. 3 days passed before Walther von Brauchitsch, the German army commander-in-chief, was able to persuade Hitler to withdraw his orders and allow the German armored forces to advance on Dunkirk. But they met stronger opposition from the British, who had had time to solidify their defenses, and almost immediately Hitler stopped the German armored forces again, ordering them instead to move south and prepare for the attack on the Somme-Aisne line. The campaign in northern France was wound up by Kuckeler's forces, after both Guderian and Reichenau had been ordered southward. Altogether, the Germans had taken more than 1 million prisoners in 3 weeks, at a cost of 60,000 casualties. Some 220,000 Allied troops, however, were rescued by British ships from France's northwestern ports, Cherbourg, St. Malo, Brest, and St. Nazaire, thus bringing the total of Allied troops evacuated to about 558,000. There remained the French armies south of the German Somme-Aisne front. The French had lost 30 divisions in the campaign so far. Weygand still managed to muster 49 divisions, apart from the 17 left to hold the Maginot Line, but against him the Germans had 130 infantry divisions as well as their 10 divisions of tanks. The Germans, after redisposing their units, began a new offensive on June 5 from their positions on the Somme. The French resisted stiffly for 2 days, but on June 7 the German tanks in the westernmost sector, led by Major General Erwin Rommel, broke through toward Rouen, and on June 9 they were over the Seine. On June 9 the Germans attacked on the Aisne. The infantry forced the crossings, and then Guderian's armor drove through the breach toward Chalons-sur-Marne before turning eastward for the Swiss frontier, thus isolating all the French forces still holding the Maginot Line.